Imagine stepping outside on a perfectly sunny Tuesday, taking a deep, refreshing breath of morning air, and suddenly realizing it tastes intensely like copper and rotten eggs. You cough, just once, but instead of clearing your throat, you spit out a handful of bright red blood. You look up, terrified, expecting to see a massive fleet of alien warships dropping nuclear bombs. But the sky is completely empty. There are no lasers piercing the clouds. There are no deafening explosions rattling the windows. The invasion has already begun. And the absolute most terrifying truth is, they aren't going to blow up your planet. They are going to forcefully, painfully choke it to death while you are still breathing it. Forget everything Hollywood has ever taught you about interstellar warfare. Forget the Death Stars. Forget the orbital laser bombardments and the massive armies of killer robots marching through the streets. Blowing up a planet is a completely idiotic waste of cosmic real estate. If a hyper-advanced galactic empire wants to take over your world, they don't want glowing radioactive craters. They want your raw minerals, your deep underground aquifers, and your strategic position in the galaxy. They just don't want you. So how do you completely eradicate 8 billion deeply entrenched, heavily armed human beings without destroying the absolute core value of the planet itself? Enter the most sadistic, psychologically devastating, and unapologetically brutal weapon ever conceived in the history of the universe, the offensive terraforming array, or, as military tacticians would coldly refer to it, a localized atmospheric rewrite. It begins entirely in silence. You wouldn't even know it was happening until it was far too late. Thousands of massive, unmanned orbital dispersers slide perfectly into the planet's upper exosphere, hiding seamlessly in the planet's shadow. These do not look like sleek, aerodynamic fighter jets. They look like colossal, floating industrial refineries, hundreds of miles across, bristling with heavy-duty thermal vents and chemical storage tanks the size of skyscrapers. And they have one singular, horrifying, mathematically calculated purpose: to violently hack the planet's climate. In perfect, terrifying synchronization, these gargantuan machines open their venting ports and begin aggressively vomiting billions of tons of hyper-concentrated sulfur dioxide, engineered halocarbons, and aerosolized sulfuric acid directly into the stratosphere. Down on the surface, the daily news doesn't report an alien invasion. They report a bizarre weather anomaly. But within a week, the beautiful blue sky starts to violently sicken. It shifts from a familiar azure to a pale, bruised purple, and finally settles into a sickly, jaundiced, glowing yellow. The global temperatures plummet artificially as the thick, toxic chemical cloud layer violently blocks out the sun, plunging the entire planet into an eerie, permanent twilight. The psychological terror begins to set in. Governments blindly scramble fighter jets. Radar stations go on to high alert, but there is absolutely nothing to shoot down. You cannot fire an anti-aircraft missile at a toxic cloud. You cannot declare a ground war on the weather. You are fighting the sky itself, and the sky is overwhelmingly winning. Then, the atmospheric pressure violently shifts. The barometers completely crash, and the absolute nightmare truly begins. The planet's natural water cycle is completely corrupted and fundamentally weaponized. When the dark, swollen yellow clouds finally break, they do not drop life-giving water. They rain industrial-grade, highly corrosive liquid sulfuric acid. This isn't a light, irritating drizzle that gives you a mild rash or ruins your car's paint job. This is a torrential, planetary downpour of liquid, sizzling death. The moment the acid rain hits the planet's surface, the biological devastation is instantaneous and spectacular. Millions of acres of green, vibrant forests instantly begin to smoke, flash frying into blackened, dissolving sludge as the acid aggressively rips the moisture straight out of the cellular walls of the plants. The oceans violently froth, hiss, and boil as their pH levels aggressively crash. The delicate marine ecosystems, from the microscopic plankton to the massive blue whales, undergo a mass extinction event in a matter of hours, turning the majestic blue oceans into a toxic, brown, acidic soup of floating, dissolving biological matter. But what happens to our massive, sprawling human cities? You might logically think that thick concrete and reinforced steel would survive a rainstorm. You would be dead wrong. When pure sulfuric acid relentlessly pounds against a modern metropolis, the chemical reaction is catastrophic to witness. The acid aggressively and relentlessly eats through the calcium carbonate in the concrete, literally turning towering, proud skyscrapers into soft, crumbling, bleeding gypsum. Massive steel suspension bridges groan violently and snap in half as their thick support cables dissolve into rusted, melted splinters under the relentless chemical assault. The entire city begins to physically melt into the ground like a wax candle placed inside an industrial blast furnace. And what about humanity? What happens to the billions of people desperately trying to run? You simply cannot outrun the air. The moment the acid rain heavily hits the hot pavement, it rapidly undergoes a chemical reaction and releases massive, rolling, invisible clouds of toxic, heavy sulfur gas that hug the ground and aggressively flood into homes, basements, and subway tunnels. The human body is entirely unprepared for this. Every single breath you take feels exactly like swallowing a lit blowtorch. The soft, delicate tissue in the human lungs instantly liquefies upon contact, turning into a bubbling, bloody froth. People literally agonizingly drown in their own melting internal organs while standing completely dry in their living rooms, clawing desperately at their throats as their eyes painfully burn away in their sockets. So you do the only logical, desperate thing a human being can do. You run deep underground. The billionaires, the military generals, the lucky few who manage to make it into the deep, subterranean, heavily fortified bunkers slam the massive, vault-like steel doors shut. They aggressively engage the high-tech atmospheric air scrubbers. They sit in the cold, flickering light and deeply believe they have successfully survived the apocalypse. But they are completely wrong. They are just trapped inside a slow-motion, highly expensive steel coffin. Because the enemy doesn't just want to melt the surface. The orbital dispersers continue their silent, relentless work for months on end, aggressively thickening the atmosphere until the planet's overall atmospheric pressure forcefully doubles, mimicking the crushing, hellish environment of Venus. The mechanical air scrubbers in the human bunkers were specifically designed for normal Earth pressure and standard oxygen mixtures. Under this new, crushing alien atmosphere, the intake valves forcefully buckle and shatter. The highly acidic gas violently floods the ventilation shafts, eating through the rubber seals of the blast doors. There is no glorious last stand. There is no heroic counterattack. There is just the terrifying, deafening hiss of melting vents, the frantic screaming of the bunker alarms, and then total, agonizing, permanent silence. But here is the most chilling, cold-blooded part of this entire apocalyptic scenario. Why use sulfuric acid? Why not a fast-acting nerve gas or a deadly biological virus? Because this isn't just an execution, it is a calculated planetary renovation. Sulfuric acid is incredibly lethal to organic life and completely destroys human infrastructure, but it is not permanently radioactive. Over the span of a few centuries, the extreme chemical reactions will eventually stop. The heavy sulfur will naturally bind with the rocks in the planet's crust. The atmosphere will chemically stabilize, and the violent, artificially induced greenhouse effect will slowly cool off. A few hundred years after the absolute last human being painfully chokes to death in the dark, the massive alien fleet finally descends from the stars. They land gracefully on a completely sanitized, perfectly quiet world. The oceans are sterile, empty basins waiting to be reseeded. The forests are gone. The human cities are nothing more than smoothed-over hills of melted, hardened dust. The conquerors didn't have to fire a single explosive round. They didn't have to risk a single soldier in a bloody ground war. They simply changed the chemical recipe of the sky, turned the planet's own weather system into an unstoppable biological meat grinder, and waited patiently for the world to suffocate itself. So the next time you feel a cool drop of rain on your face and smell a faint metallic hint of ozone in the air before a storm, you really have to ask yourself, is it just the weather changing? Or is the sky actively preparing to dissolve you alive?